If you're going through a dark night of the soul, or even just a run-of-the-mill depression, I've made this video for you. Because this is a terrain that I am far, far too familiar with on both accounts. And I also think that they're both related. You know, a standard depression can sometimes lead to an awakening process, and an awakening process can sometimes lead to a dark night of the soul. In some of the Buddhist framing, you know, depression and some of these darker experiences in life are even seen as a blessing in terms of the possibility of awakening, because it provides someone with real motivation to awaken, to try and free themselves from suffering. Whether if life is really easeful, or the time if we're born into a karmic incarnation where, you know, we don't really struggle very much, there's not a lot of cause for deep inner looking. There's not a lot of reason to kind of go in search of something better. So yeah, it kind of flips your perspective of good karma, bad karma, when you start to look at things like this. And I in no way want to diminish or, you know, I don't want to create a false positivity around depression, because it is a genuine struggle, and it's something that can cause so much suffering, both in the lives of people experiencing it and in those around them. So it's not something to be taken lightly, or to just be sort of twisted into this spiritual frame. You know, we want to have respect for the material reality that we live in, and the way that life manifests very genuine challenges. They, yes, are immaterial in terms of the grand scheme of things, but in our everyday experience, they're very, very real. And we have to contend with the reality of that struggle. We have to find a way to make it workable in our lives. So in terms of dark night of the soul, we might look at it as a period of time where, you know, all of the darker emotions start to arise. Some of our trauma is coming up to the surface, where the sense of motivation along the spiritual path is significantly reduced, where we kind of feel very, very alone and somewhat disconnected from beingness itself. But that isn't always the case. You know, there can be a strong sense of grace in and amidst the suffering. And we can still have a great deal of faith in, you know, I'm thinking here too, if I terribly paraphrase the Merton prayer, that aspect of the prayer that Thomas Merton wrote, where he was sort of saying, well, you know, I don't know where I'm going, God, and I don't know if I'm following the right path, and I don't know if I'm doing your will, but at least, you know, I know that my desire to please you, my desire to do what is divine will rather than my own will, is going to please you in some way, is going to inspire divine grace. So there can be this sense in them amongst the suffering of, even if we don't feel like we're in direct contact with divinity in the same way that we might outside of a dark night of the soul, there's still a belief that we're on some sort of path, and that something is engaged in our process, through grace, through love, through deep consciousness. And that isn't always easier than, say, a run-of-the-mill depression, because, you know, when I experienced depression as a younger person, and I didn't have as much consciousness or awareness or spiritual orientation as I do now, it was much easier to kind of distance myself from the pain, to, I guess, shift blame, or not be accountable for things. And even though this created more suffering in the long run, in the short term, it was kind of a good way of dissociating or getting out of what was really happening, not having to face the root causes of the suffering that I was coming up against. And so, when we start to approach things like depression from a real consciousness perspective, when we're deeper into our awareness, when we're less identified with the stories that are orienting around the emotions, then we need to really experience the emotions in their rawness and in their truth. And that is super challenging on a somatic level. It's the sensitivity to what is actually happening in our nervous system and in our body is deeply enhanced. And for me, the way that I experienced this is it became much less easy to kind of function through depressive episodes the more and more clarity I was gaining in awareness. Because a lot of that functioning was driven by sort of automated processes. And now all of a sudden those automated programs of the ego have broken down, and it's necessary to kind of find a way of being in relationship with the experience of depression in the nervous system and in the body, rather than just building stories about it and kind of recanting those stories to myself or to others. So Dark Night of the Soul, in a lot of these videos on spirituality, it's often presented as a singular episode, like this really big kind of crash of the emotional, spiritual, physical self. And then, we go through the gauntlet there, and then we come out the other side and we're perhaps on a side more akin to enlightenment, and then that's it. The dark night of the soul is a thing. However, I think it's more of a spiralic pattern. It's much more of a reoccurring experience for me, and yet there's a different quality each time it comes round, or a different level of depth of seeing. Because really, any of these experiences are just an opportunity for seeing. It's an opportunity for us to look at a different aspect of the self. And the deep, painful emotions, the darkness, the intrusive thoughts, the things that arise, which, take us into the demonic realms, or the, what we might consider as darkness. These are just aspects of self, aspects of reality, one of the facets of truth, of divine beingness in a material form. And so we have an opportunity during a dark night of the soul to really absorb, allow, pay homage to the diversity of this self, this experience of consciousness embodying itself in many diversities. And we pay homage to a part of that which the human being and the human ego tends to shy away from, tends to want to avoid. So it's like breaking through, right? If there's the facade, I don't like the term facade because I have other ideas about what ego is, but if we were to say for the moment that the ego is a facade of reality, that it's the constructed story of who we are, it's trying to maintain a particular image or a particular story. And usually that story really wants to be happiness, joy, light, peace, harmony, grace, success, easefulness. This is what the human is attuned to. from an egoic perspective, but it's not the whole of reality. And we need to be able to see every single aspect of reality in order to truly become that which is consciousness, which is the one, because the one includes everything. And so the dark night of the soul gives us a break through the facade of reality. It gives us a window into all the aspects that we haven't been looking at, that we haven't been wanting to confront or to integrate. It takes us into the shadow realm. If we're in resistance to this, this is where stuff gets really difficult, because the resistance starts to amplify the experience. And it may not seem that initially, it may not seem like resistance amplifies. Perhaps we successfully succeed at suppressing some of our feelings of despair or aloneness or void, pain, suffering, whatever it happens to be. But that suppression just builds the energy of it. And then it tends to erupt in rather unexpected ways. And I experienced this recently, actually, because, one of the things that was being presented to me as a part of my reality for the last few months has been a high level of anxiety. The presence of anxiety nowadays, doesn't come with a lot of story, although, I catch myself at it, definitely. But it's felt much more physiologically, like there's an awareness through my sensory experience and my interoception, or the internal embodied experience of the hormonal chemical changes, the neural pathways firing. There's a real kind of nuance to the experience of anxiety. And because of that, it's actually way more challenging to be with than my previous anxiety, which I could kind of diffuse. In a way, I could diffuse that energy by getting really busy or by trying to fix the problems, And yeah, I still try and fix the problems, but at a much slower rate and with a lot more deep listening into what consciousness actually is asking me to do. And so that means that in being with the experience, this visceral, embodied expression of anxiety is really confronting. It's quite strong feeling. And I noticed over the last few weeks that, I had been trying to, I guess, bypass that, right? Some of the old patterning around not feeling the feelings was coming up. But it was coming up in a way more subtle way than it used to. And this is so common, the further along we get in developing presence and awareness, the more subtle and tricksy these coping mechanisms engage themselves. And so I kind of had this story in my head that I was being fully with the experience and with the emotion, and I was really allowing that to be there. And at the same time, I had unconsciously constructed some restrictions around how that could be in reality. What I wanted the reality of being with anxiety to look like, rather than what the reality of being with anxiety actually was. And the result of this was an eruption. It was an eruption into a significant panic attack like I hadn't experienced for a very long time, which took me as a surprise. And then there's also the emotions of shame and fear that come up with that, of like, am I backsliding? Is this, is this an expression of my lack of consciousness, and all of those sorts of questions. So being able to step outside both of those stories, like both the story of how anxiety should present itself in my life, as well as, you know, ideas about shame or judgment or, framing things as enlightened or not enlightened ways of being in the world, to actually step beyond that and sit in a space of open awareness of what's unfolding. Not to say not being responsible for behavior, because absolutely, that is a part of our human manifestation. Um, but to really just acknowledge, oh, there I am. There is fear, there is anxiety, there is panic, there is depression, all rolled into a snowball. And it's messy. It's actually really, really messy. And this is where we can start to know, if we are in a genuine dark night of the soul, we do start to step a little bit to the side, not dissociate from, but just as a companion, there's the awareness companioning the experience much more so than in a regular depressive episode where the expression of that depression just builds itself over and over and over again into story, into the construct of what is happening rather than the direct experiencing of what is happening. And the direct experiencing of what is happening in a dark night is super messy. And it's one that doesn't tidily confine itself to a singular episode. So for me, I had probably the biggest experience of dark night maybe eight years ago, but it spanned quite a few years in and of itself. Let's say there was some good buffer on either side of that 8-year mark. And, there's sort of like this coming to the surface of those depths and then a dipping back under and a coming to the surface and a dipping back under. And I do feel like over the years, there's more and more buoyancy, more and more space to breathe outside of that experience. But it's not gone in any respect, right? However, the vision of what that means and, why it's happening is very, very different, because it's not a story anymore about reality being out to get me. Likewise, it's not a story about divine intervention or some sort of special initiation into becoming, one of the enlightened ones. And I think this is one of the problematics that we come across with dark night concepts in the spiritual cultures is we can sort of start to view our suffering through this lens of like a necessary initiation into becoming, which in a way it is, but, and if we get caught in that story, then we tend to get attached to the suffering. We can start to really hold on to the experience of these being tossed in the depths or, like smashed by the waves. And instead of allowing ourselves to naturally become more buoyant as consciousness moves us in that direction, we can resist the lifting back towards lightness and ease just as much as we might have formerly resisted being pushed into the depths and the dark. Or certain people can have a tendency towards one or the other. For some folks, it's very challenging to actually yield and surrender into the darker experiences of reality. And for some people, it's much easier to do shadow work than it is to kind of embrace divinity and light and easefulness in life. So just observing what our tendency is and what kind of stories we construct around that is a very helpful thing. Being with and in the experience itself doesn't ask for anything more than genuine experiencing, to feel the sadness, feel the grief, feel the confusion, to not try and solve what's arising. I think this is a big thing with many folks, is our cultures have conditioned us to be really solutions oriented or goal oriented. And so we start to get into these habits of trying to fix ourselves. And again, this is all about balance, right? The middle way. We don't need to lie down on the floor and never get up again and say, well, this is just a part of my awakening process, and therefore, it's not my responsibility to pick myself up because that's what consciousness does. Well, you are consciousness. You are a distillation of the Great One Being. And so, yes, it very much is your responsibility to start to take action in some directions. And you can listen carefully to your intuition as to the ripeness and the direction of those actions. But without action, there's no energetic movement, there's no flow of the energy of consciousness. And in that stagnation, we can get very much stuck in a dark night or in a depressive episode. So simply starting to, I guess, invite some gentle movement. And that can come in so many different ways. It might be taking a walk, even if you don't feel like a walk. It could be lying down on the floor and doing a few spinal twists. If you're in a really, really difficult state, it could be just saying, well, I'm going to stand up outside of bed, count to 10, and then if I really feel like getting back into bed, I can. We adjust the benchmark for movement according to what we're actually capable of in terms of the difficulty of what we're experiencing. But to have some sort of willingness toward difference, towards something other than what we are attached to. So if we're attached to the light, perhaps dipping our toe into shadow work. If we're attached to the shadow work and the depths and the torturous sensation of initiation, then maybe it's actually just taking a moment to have a cup of tea with a friend and not talk about the things that are too hard. It's balance. It's finding, in yoga it's called pratipakshabhavana, the balancing of opposites. We take a little bit of a dose of something different to what we feel is the only thing available in order to reveal more of reality. Because the other side of our reality is always present. The darkness implicates the light, and the light implicates the darkness. They are absolutely dependent upon one another. And so if we're only willing to look at one of those, there's a problem. There's a reduction in our capacity to understand the wholeness of truth and the wholeness of divine being. Thank you very much for hanging out with me today. This was my walk outside. And yeah, it's definitely got more uh, presence and fullness of reality available within it. And it's not a denial of the suffering or the challenge. It's simply this too. Yes, and the self is a paradox. I hope you get to enjoy the miraculousness of that paradox in whatever state you happen to be. Have a good day.